before we begin this incredible story of dignity, strength, and justice, I want you to do something for me. Take a moment right now and comment below. Tell me where you're watching from. Whether you're in New York, London, Tokyo, or any town I've never heard of, I want to know you're here with me. And if stories about everyday heroes finding their power inspire you, hit that subscribe button right now. Because what you're about to witness will change how you see the quiet people around you forever. This is the story of Evelyn Cole. And I promise you, by the end, you'll never look at janitor, a cleaner, or anyone society overlooks the same way again. The fluorescent lights hummed their eternal song in the corridors of Meridian Research Labs, casting everything in that harsh, institutional glow that makes shadows look deeper and people look smaller. It was 5:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in October, and the building held that particular silence that comes just before the world wakes up, heavy, expectant, almost sacred. Evelyn Cole pushed her cleaning cart down the polished hallway with the same steady rhythm she'd maintained for the past 8 years. 55 years old, medium height, with graying brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, she moved through the building like a ghost, present but invisible, essential but unnoticed. Her navy blue uniform was immaculate, pressed with military precision, though no one who worked here would ever think to connect that detail to anything significant about her past. She paused outside Laboratory 7, the molecular biology wing where Dr. Marcus Hale conducted his research. Through the reinforced glass, she could see him already at work, his tall frame hunched over a microscope, dark hair perfectly styled even at this ungodly hour. At 38, Dr. Hale was considered a rising star in genetic research, with publications in prestigious journals and a reputation for brilliance that preceded him everywhere he went. Evelyn knocked softly and waited. This was the protocol. Always announce yourself. Always wait for permission. Always remember your place in the hierarchy. The unwritten rules that kept the building functioning, that kept people like her safely invisible. "Come in," came the sharp voice from inside. She entered quietly, her rubber-soled shoes making no sound on the laboratory floor. The space smelled of chemicals and ambition, that particular cocktail of disinfectant, reagents, and a metallic scent of expensive equipment. Dr. Hale didn't look up from his work, didn't acknowledge her presence beyond those 2 words of permission. This was how it always was. Evelyn had cleaned this lab thousands of times, had worked around Dr. Hale's schedule for 3 years since he'd arrived at Meridian, and he had never once looked her in the eye, never asked her name, never said good morning, never even nodded in recognition. To him, she was furniture that happened to move. She began her routine, emptying wastebaskets, wiping down surfaces, sanitizing equipment. Her movements were economical, practiced, almost meditative. There was something peaceful about this work, something that reminded her of other routines from another life. The precision required, the attention to detail, the importance of getting everything exactly right even when no one was watching. As she cleaned, she listened, not intentionally. It wasn't her place to eavesdrop, but Dr. Hale was on a conference call with someone, his voice carrying clearly in the sterile air. "The preliminary results are promising, but we need more time," he was saying, leaning back in his chair with the casual confidence of someone who'd never been told no. "The funding committee doesn't understand complexity of what we're attempting here. They want results yesterday, but breakthrough science doesn't work on their timeline." Evelyn continued her work, but something in his tone made her glance up. She'd heard this conversation before, or versions of it. Dr. Hale was always fighting for more money, more time, more resources, always positioning himself as the brilliant scientist held back by lesser minds who couldn't appreciate his vision. "No, I won't compromise the integrity of the research for their quarterly reports," he continued, his voice rising slightly. "If they want a scientist who will fake results to meet deadlines, they hired the wrong man." Evelyn almost smiled at that. In her 8 years at Meridian, she'd seen a lot of scientists come and go. She'd cleaned up after their late-night experiments, their celebration parties when grants came through, their breakdown moments when projects failed. She developed an ear for the genuine ones versus the ones who were more interested in their own image than their work. Dr. Hale, she concluded long ago, fell firmly into the latter category. She moved to clean the chemical fume hood, carefully wiping around the equipment Dr. Hale had left out. This required delicate work. These instruments cost more than she made in 2 years, and any damage would be catastrophic, not just for the research, but for her job. Her hands moved with steady precision, the kind that came from years of handling dangerous things, of understanding that one mistake could have consequences far beyond the immediate moment. "Careful there." Dr. Hale's voice cut through her concentration like a blade. She looked up to see him watching her with sharp, Dark eyes. That spectrometer is worth more than you'll make in your lifetime. Maybe focus on the floors instead of pretending you understand laboratory equipment. The words hit like a physical blow, not because they were particularly cruel by Dr. Hale's standards, but because of the casual dismissal in his voice. The assumption that she was too stupid to understand what she was doing, too insignificant to deserve basic respect. Evelyn met his eyes for just a moment, long enough to see the cold amusement there, the satisfaction he took in establishing the hierarchy between them. Then she lowered her gaze and nodded. Yes, sir. Of course. She moved away from the equipment and began mopping the floor, her movements as steady as before, but with a slight tension in her shoulders that hadn't been there moments earlier. Dr. Hale returned to his call, already dismissing her again, already forgetting that she was even there. But Evelyn didn't forget. She never forgot anything, a trait that served her well in her previous career and continued to serve her now. She filed away the interaction, the tone, the casual cruelty of it, in the same mental space where she stored all the other small humiliations that made up her daily existence at Meridian Labs. As she worked, her mind drifted to other mornings, other routines from a time when her uniform was different and respect came with the territory. 22 years in the Army, rising to the rank of Sergeant Major, serving 3 tours in conflict zones where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death of the soldiers under her command. She'd been decorated for valor, commended for leadership, trusted with responsibilities that most people couldn't imagine. Then David got sick. The memory came like it always did, sudden and sharp, cutting through whatever peace she'd managed to find in the present moment. Her husband, her partner for 30 years, reduced to a shadow of himself by the cancer that ate away at him bit by bit. The medical bills that insurance wouldn't cover. The experimental treatments that might have helped if only they could afford them. The impossible choice between her military career and the man she loved more than life itself. She'd chosen David, of course. Had taken early retirement to care for him, to spend his final months making sure he was comfortable, loved, not alone. And when he was gone, when the funeral was over and the bills were still coming, she found herself 50 years old with no civilian job experience and a resume that most employers didn't know how to read. Meridian Labs had been willing to hire her for the night cleaning shift. It paid enough to cover her small apartment and basic expenses, plus health insurance that was better than nothing. It wasn't a life she'd planned, but it was honest work, and after everything she'd been through, honest work felt like a gift. The only problem was people like Dr. Marcus Hale, who saw her uniform and her mop bucket and decided they knew everything about who she was and what she was worth. She finished the lab floor and began collecting her supplies, moving with the same quiet efficiency that had become her trademark at Meridian. Dr. Hale was still on his call, now pacing behind his desk with the phone pressed to his ear. I don't care what the other departments are producing, he was saying, his voice tight with frustration. My research will revolutionize cancer treatment, but only if it's done right. I won't be rushed by bureaucrats who measure success in quarterly reports instead of human lives saved. Cancer treatment. Evelyn's hand still for a moment on the handle of her mop bucket. She thought of David again, of all the treatments they'd researched, all the experimental procedures they'd begged insurance to cover, all the hope they'd invested in doctors who promised miracles and delivered bills they couldn't pay. She wondered if Dr. Hale's research might have helped David, if it had been available 5 years ago. The thought brought a complex mix of emotions, hope for other families who might not have to watch someone they love waste away, and a bitter irony that she was now cleaning the lab where such miracles might be born while being treated like she was too stupid to understand what a miracle looked like. Same time tomorrow, she asked quietly as she prepared to leave. Dr. Hale didn't look up from his call, just waved her away with one hand like he was shooing away a fly. Evelyn left the lab and continued her rounds, but something had shifted in the careful balance she'd maintained for 8 years. Maybe it was a particular cruelty in his voice when he dismissed her intelligence, or maybe it was the mention of cancer research bringing back memories she usually kept locked away. Whatever it was, she felt a stirring of something she thought she left behind with her military career, a sense of her own worth that had nothing to do with other people's opinions. She finished her shift as the sun was coming up, painting the eastern windows of Meridian Labs in shades of gold and pink. The day shift would arrive soon. The scientists and researchers and administrators who saw the building as their domain, who walked past her like she was part of the infrastructure rather than a human being. Most days, she was okay with that invisibility. It was peaceful in its way. It let her do her job without drama, earn her paycheck without complications, go home to her quiet apartment and her memories and her books without having performed for anyone. But today felt different. Today, she found herself remembering what it felt like to wear a uniform that commanded respect, to have her expertise valued, to be seen as someone whose opinion mattered. Today, she remembered what it felt like to be Sergeant Major Evelyn Cole instead of just Evelyn the cleaning lady. She changed out her work clothes in the employee locker room, hanging up her navy blue uniform with the same care she'd once given to hanging up her dress blues. In the small mirror mounted on her locker door, she caught sight herself, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and capable hands, invisible to most of the world, but carrying within her a lifetime of experience that people like Dr. Hale would never see. The drive home took her through the awakening city, past coffee shops opening their doors and commuters beginning their daily migration to offices and factories and schools. She'd once been part of that morning rush, back when David was alive, and she had a job that started at a reasonable hour. Now she was going to bed as the world was waking up, maintaining the opposite schedule that kept her separate from the mainstream flow of life. Her apartment was small but immaculate, furnished with the few pieces she and David had managed to keep when they downsized after his diagnosis. Military precision extended to her personal space. Everything had its place. Everything was maintained in perfect condition. Everything reflected the discipline that had shaped her character over decades of service. She made herself a simple breakfast and sat at her small kitchen table, looking out the window at the neighborhood coming to life. Children walking to school, parents rushing to work, delivery trucks making their rounds. Normal life, the kind she'd once taken for granted and now observed from the outside. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her sister Sarah, who lived across the country and worried about Evelyn living alone. Thinking about you today. Hope work is going well. Love you. Evelyn smiled and typed back a brief response. All good here. Love you too. She didn't mention Dr. Hale's casual cruelty, didn't explain how it had stirred up memories she preferred to keep buried. Sarah worried enough already, still guilt-ridden about not being able to help more when David was sick, still trying to convince Evelyn to move closer to family. The last thing she needed was more reasons to worry. Besides, Evelyn had handled worse than entitled scientists in her time. Much worse. She finished her breakfast, washed her dishes, and prepared for bed, following the routine that had kept her grounded through the past 8 years of night shifts and quiet days. But as she lay in her bed, watching the late morning light filter through her bedroom curtains, she found her mind returning to Laboratory 7 and the man who worked there, Dr. Marcus Hale, who saw her as furniture. Dr. Marcus Hale, who assumed she was too stupid to understand the value of scientific equipment. Dr. Marcus Hale, who had no idea that the woman cleaning his lab had once been responsible for managing multi-million-dollar military equipment in active combat zones. For 8 years, she'd accepted the invisibility, had even found peace in it. But something about this morning had awakened a part of her she'd thought was dormant, a part that remembered what it felt like to command respect rather than beg for basic human decency. As she drifted off to sleep, Evelyn found herself wondering what would happen if someone like Dr. Hale ever pushed too far, ever crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. She'd spent her entire military career learning how to assess threats, neutralize problems, and protect the people under her command. What would happen, she wondered drowsily, if she ever had to remember how to do those things again? 3 weeks later, the question would no longer be theoretical. Dr. Marcus Hale was having the worst month of his career, and he was ready to take it out on someone. The funding committee had denied his request for additional resources, citing concerns about his research timeline and preliminary results that didn't meet their expectations. His ex-wife was demanding higher alimony payments, claiming his published salary figures didn't reflect his true earning potential. And this morning, his coffee maker had broken, leaving him to face the day without the caffeine routine that usually made early mornings bearable. He stood in Laboratory 7, staring at the latest batch of test results that showed promise but not the breakthrough he'd been hoping for. Behind him, he could hear the soft sounds of the cleaning lady doing her work, the same ghost who appeared every morning like clockwork, invisible and irrelevant. Except this morning, she made a mistake. The crash of broken glass echoed through the lab like a gunshot. Dr. Hale spun around to see Evelyn standing frozen beside his workbench, a shattered beaker at her feet, and a look of horrified dismay on her face. But it wasn't just any beaker. It was a container holding his most promising cell culture, 3 weeks of careful cultivation, irreplaceable samples that had taken months to prepare, the foundation of his next round of experiments, the work that might save his funding, the research that was supposed to prove his theories, the breakthrough that could salvage his reputation and his career. All of it, now spreading across the floor in a puddle of shattered glass and wasted potential. "You stupid clumsy." The words exploded out of him before he could stop them, but stopping them was the last thing on his mind. Months of frustration, weeks of pressure, years of dealing with people too incompetent to appreciate his brilliance, all focused into this one moment of pure, crystalline rage. He crossed the lab in 3 quick strides, and before either of them fully realized what was happening, his hand was around Evelyn's throat. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" His voice was barely controlled, his grip tightening as he spoke. "That was weeks of work. Irreplaceable samples. Research that could save lives, and you destroyed it because you're too stupid to watch where you're going." Evelyn didn't struggle, didn't cry out, didn't beg or plead, or make any of the sounds he expected from someone in her position. Instead, she went perfectly still, her gray eyes fixing on his with an intensity that should have been impossible for a cleaning lady to possess. For a moment that stretched longer than it should have, they stared at each other, Dr. Hale with his hand on her throat, his face flushed with anger and self-righteousness. Evelyn with her feet planted, her breathing controlled, her entire body coiled with a tension that seemed to come from somewhere much deeper than fear. And in that moment, something shifted between them, something fundamental and irreversible. Dr. Hale felt it first, a change in the quality of Evelyn's stillness, a sense that the woman he was choking was not the same person who had been cleaning his lab every morning for 3 years. The eyes looking back at him held knowledge and capability that had nothing to do with mop buckets and floor polish. But his anger was too hot, his frustration too complete, for him to process what his instincts were trying to tell him. Instead, he tightened his grip and leaned closer. "You're going to pay for this," he hissed. "Every penny. And if you can't afford it, which I'm sure you can't, you're going to find yourself looking for a new job. Security will escort you out of this building, and I'll make sure every lab in the city knows what happens when they hire incompetent." He stopped talking because Evelyn had moved, not dramatically, not with the obvious violence he might have expected if he'd been thinking clearly. Instead, her right hand had somehow found its way to his wrist, the one attached to the hand around her throat, and her fingers had settled into a grip that felt like a steel trap closing. She didn't squeeze, didn't apply pressure, didn't do anything that would leave marks or cause obvious injury. But suddenly, Dr. Marcus Hale found that he could not move his arm, could not adjust his grip, could not do anything except stand there, while this cleaning lady held him in place with a technique he didn't understand and strength he couldn't have imagined. "Dr. Hale," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the hand on her throat, "I think you should let me go now." It wasn't a plea. It wasn't begging. It was suggestion delivered in the same tone someone might use to point out that it was raining outside or that the coffee was getting cold. Matter of fact, professional, completely without fear. And that lack of fear, more than anything else, finally got through to Dr. Hale's anger-clouded mind. He looked into Evelyn's gray eyes and saw something that made his mouth go dry and his heart start beating faster. He saw someone who was not afraid of him. Someone who was, in fact, completely unimpressed by his display of dominance. Someone who was waiting, patiently, calmly, for him to realize that he had just made a very serious mistake. Dr. Hale released her throat and stepped back, and Evelyn let go of his wrist. For a moment, they stood there in the wreckage of his experiment, both breathing carefully, both reassessing everything they thought they knew about the other. "Clean that up," Dr. Hale said finally, his voice hoarse and uncertain. And we'll discuss the replacement costs later." Evelyn nodded once, a sharp military acknowledgement that he almost recognized but couldn't quite place. "Of course, sir." She knelt to begin collecting the broken glass, and Dr. Hale fled the laboratory like it was on fire. Behind him, alone with the shattered remains of his experiment, Evelyn Cole worked with steady hands to clean up the mess. But inside her chest, her heart was beating the rhythm of a war drum, and in her mind, dormant skills were stirring to life like flowers blooming after a long winter. Dr. Marcus Hale had just awakened something he didn't understand and couldn't control. And tomorrow morning, she would be back. That night, Evelyn Cole did not sleep. She lay in her bed staring at the ceiling, feeling the phantom pressure of Dr. Hale's hand around her throat and remembering the moment when 22 years of military training had surged back to life like electricity through dead wires. Her body still hummed with the aftermath, not from fear, but from the sudden, shocking recognition of who she used to be, who she still was, underneath 8 years of invisible servitude. She rose before her alarm and stood in her bathroom, looking at herself in the mirror by the harsh fluorescent light. There were no marks on her throat. Dr. Hale hadn't applied enough pressure for long enough to leave bruises, but she could still feel the violation of it. The casual assumption that he had the right to put his hands on her in anger. In Afghanistan, a soldier under her command had once grabbed a local woman in frustration, during a tense moment at a checkpoint. Evelyn had removed him from duty immediately and spent 3 hours in disciplinary meetings that ended with formal charges and a permanent mark on his service record. The incident had been minor compared to what Dr. Hale had done, a brief touch rather than sustained contact. But the principle was the same. No one had the right to put their hands on another person in anger. Not ever. Not for any reason. She dressed in her uniform with more care than usual, each movement precise and deliberate. Navy blue pants, navy blue shirt, rubber-soled shoes that made no sound on laboratory floors. The costume of invisibility that she'd worn for 8 years, but today it felt different. Today it felt like camouflage. The drive to Meridian Labs took her through the sleeping city, past darkened office buildings and empty parking lots. She'd made this journey thousands of times. But tonight she found herself noticing details she'd previously overlooked: security camera locations, exit routes, the timing of traffic lights. Skills she thought were dormant, observations that came automatically to someone trained to assess tactical situations. She parked in her usual spot and sat for a moment before going inside, letting her mind drift back to the moment when Dr. Hale's hand had closed around her throat. The shock of it, yes, but more than that, the immediate, instinctive response that flowed through her like muscle memory. Control the weapon, assess the threat, neutralize if necessary. Her right hand had moved to his wrist without conscious thought, fingers finding the pressure points that would have allowed her to break his grip or break his bones, depending on what the situation required. For a heartbeat, she'd been Sergeant Major Cole again, responsible for the safety of her people, empowered to use whatever force was necessary to protect them. Then the moment had passed, and she'd been Evelyn the cleaning lady again, expected to accept abuse as part of the job description. But the memory of that power, that capability, that sense of her own worth, it stayed with her now like a flame that couldn't be extinguished. She entered the building and began her rounds, moving to familiar routines but with a hyper-awareness she hadn't felt in years. Every sound seemed sharper, every shadow more defined. Her body moved with a fluidity she'd forgotten she possessed, muscles remembering coordination drills and combat exercises from decades of training. Laboratory 7 was her last stop. As always, through the reinforced glass, she could see Dr. Hale at his workstation, but something was different about his posture tonight. Instead of the confident slouch she was used to, he sat rigidly upright, glancing toward the door every few minutes like he was expecting trouble. Good. He should be expecting trouble. She knocked and waited, but the come-in took longer than usual, and when it came, his voice carried a note of tension that hadn't been there yesterday. Evelyn entered the lab and began her work, but she could feel Dr. Hale's eyes on her in a way that was completely different from his usual dismissive indifference. He was watching her now, studying her movements, trying to reconcile the woman cleaning his floors with the person who controlled him so effortlessly the morning before. "About yesterday," he said suddenly, his voice carefully controlled. "I want to make it clear that what happened was inappropriate. I was frustrated about the experiment, but that's no excuse for losing my temper." Evelyn looked up from the wastebasket. She was emptying. Dr. Hale was watching her with dark eyes that held a wariness she'd never seen before. He was afraid of her, she realized. Not terrified, but genuinely uncertain about what she might do or say, about what kind of person he was really dealing with. The smart thing would be to accept his apology graciously, to let him believe this was just a momentary lapse in judgment, that things could go back to the way they were before, to fade back into invisibility and let the incident become a footnote in both their memories. Instead, she met his eyes directly. "Apology accepted, Dr. Hale, but it won't happen again." The words came out with quiet authority, the kind of tone she'd once used to give orders to soldiers who outranked her in everything except experience and competence. Dr. Hale's eyes widened slightly, and she saw him process the certainty in her voice, the complete absence of doubt or deference. "Of course not," he said quickly. "It was a momentary lapse. It won't be repeated." Evelyn nodded once and returned to her work, but the dynamic of the room had shifted again. Yesterday, Dr. Hale had discovered that the cleaning lady wasn't as helpless as he'd assumed. Today, he was beginning to understand that she wasn't just capable of defending herself. She was someone accustomed to being obeyed. As she cleaned, her mind wandered back to the years, following threads of memory she kept carefully tucked away since David's death. The Army had been more than a career for her. It had been an identity, a purpose, a community of people who understood what it meant to serve something larger than yourself. She'd enlisted at 19, fresh out of high school in a small Missouri town where opportunities were limited and expectations for girls like her were even smaller. The military had given her structure, discipline, and most importantly, the chance to prove that she was capable of far more than anyone had ever imagined. Basic training had been brutal, designed to break down civilian thinking and rebuild it into something harder and more focused. But Evelyn had thrived under the pressure, discovering reserves of strength and determination she hadn't known she possessed. Her drill sergeants had noticed the potential early, marking her as someone who could lead others through the worst situations imaginable. 22 years of active duty had taken her all over the world. Germany during the final years of the Cold War, Saudi Arabia during the Gulf War, 3 tours in Afghanistan after September 11th, where she'd earned her stripes the hard way, keeping her soldiers alive in a landscape where death could come from any direction at any moment. She'd been good at it. Better than good, she'd been exceptional. Her personnel file was thick with commendations, efficiency reports that used words like outstanding and irreplaceable, recommendations from commanding officers who trusted her judgment more than their own. But more than the official recognition, she'd carried with her the knowledge that the men and women under her command went home to their families because she'd been there to make the right decisions at the right times. She'd been the buffer between them and chaos, the steady presence they could rely on when everything else was falling apart. Then David had gotten sick, and suddenly none of that mattered anymore. The transition to civilian life had been harder than she'd expected, not just the practical aspects, learning to navigate job interviews and workplace politics, but the psychological adjustment of going from someone whose opinion carried weight to someone whose very existence was largely ignored. For the first few months after David's funeral, she'd applied for jobs that would have made use of her leadership experience and technical skills. Security firms, consulting companies, government contractors who were always looking for people with her background and clearance level. But 8 years of unemployment, interrupted only by her role as caregiver, had created a gap in her resume that was difficult to explain in interviews. Potential employers saw a middle-aged woman who'd been out of the workforce for nearly a decade, not a decorated veteran with decades of experience managing complex operations under extreme pressure. Eventually, she'd stopped trying to explain her qualifications and started accepting whatever work was available. Meridian Labs had been one of the few places willing to hire someone with her employment gap, and the night shift cleaning position had seemed like a reasonable way to earn steady money while she figured out what came next. Except next had never come. Days had turned into months, months into years, and gradually she accepted that Evelyn the cleaning lady was who she was now. The other Evelyn, Sergeant Major Cole, the leader, the protector, the person people looked to when they needed someone strong, had been retired along with her dress blues. Until yesterday morning, when Dr. Marcus Hale's hand around her throat had awakened every dormant instinct she'd accumulated over 2 decades of military service. She finished cleaning Laboratory 7 in record time, her movements efficient and purposeful in a way that had nothing to do with housekeeping and everything to do with operational planning. Dr. Hale continued to watch her with nervous attention, but he didn't speak again, and she offered no further conversation. As she prepared to leave, gathering her supplies with military precision, she felt the weight of his gaze following her every movement. He was trying to figure her out now, trying to understand what he'd encountered in that moment of contact. But he was asking the wrong questions, making assumptions based on incomplete information. Dr. Marcus Hale thought he was dealing with a cleaning lady who had surprised him with unexpected backbone. He had no idea he was now sharing his laboratory every morning with someone who'd been trained to kill people with her bare hands if the situation required it. Someone who'd done exactly that more than once in service to her country. The rest of her shift passed in a blur of routine tasks performed with heightened awareness. Every shadow seemed to hold possibilities. Every sound carried tactical information. Her body moved with increasing fluidity as muscle memory reasserted itself, reminding her how it felt to be someone who commanded respect rather than hope for basic human decency. By the time she left Meridian Labs that morning, Evelyn Cole had made a decision that would change everything for both her and Dr. Marcus Hale. She was done being invisible. The transformation didn't happen all at once. It began with small things. The way she held her shoulders as she walked through the building, the directness of her gaze when she encountered other employees, the quality of attention she paid to conversations and interactions happening around her. For 8 years, she perfected the art of fading into the background, of becoming part of the infrastructure rather than a person worth noticing. But now she found herself observing with the analytical eye of someone trained to assess threats and opportunities, to gather intelligence and identify the true power structures operating beneath the surface. Meridian Labs, she realized, was not the harmonious research environment it pretended to be. Like most organizations, it was full of competing agendas, personal rivalries, and unspoken tensions that shaped daily interactions. As a cleaning lady, she'd been beneath the notice of the people creating and navigating these conflicts. But as someone who knew how to listen and observe, she was perfectly positioned to understand the real dynamics at play. Dr. Hale, for instance, was not nearly as secure in his position as his arrogance suggested. She'd overheard enough conversations to know that his research was behind schedule, that his funding was in jeopardy, and that several colleagues considered him difficult to work with. His cruelty towards service staff wasn't just personality. It was the behavior of someone under pressure, looking for targets he could safely dominate when he felt powerless in other areas of his life. The knowledge was useful, but more than that, it was familiar. In the military, understanding the personalities and motivations of both allies and adversaries was essential for survival. She'd spent years reading people and situations, learning to see past surface presentations to identify what people really wanted and what they were afraid of losing. Dr. Marcus Hale wanted recognition, funding, and professional success. He was afraid of failure or irrelevance, and being exposed as less brilliant than his reputation suggested. Those were significant vulnerabilities for someone who just made an enemy of a person trained in psychological operations. 3 days after the incident in Laboratory 7, Evelyn made her first strategic move. She was cleaning the administrative offices when she noticed Dr. Sarah Chun, the head of the Research Ethics Committee, working late in her office. Dr. Chin was one of the few senior staff members who'd ever acknowledged Evelyn's existence with more than a nod. Once, she'd even asked about Evelyn's weekend plans while waiting for an elevator. Evelyn knocked on the office door and waited for permission to enter. "Oh, Evelyn, come in," Dr. Chin said, looking up from a stack of papers with tired but friendly eyes. "I'm sorry you're having to work around me so late. I'll try to stay out of your way." "No trouble at all, Dr. Chun," Evelyn replied, beginning to empty the wastebasket. "I hope I'm not disturbing important work." "Just reviewing grant applications," Dr. Chun said with a slight smile, "trying to decide which projects deserve funding and which ones need more development time. Not the most exciting work, but essential for keeping the lab running." Evelyn nodded sympathetically while continuing her cleaning. After a moment, she spoke again. "I hope you don't mind me asking, but how do you evaluate whether research is ready for funding? It must be difficult to judge technical work outside your own specialty." Dr. Chin looked surprised by the question. Probably the first time the cleaning lady had ever asked her anything substantive, but her expression was interested rather than dismissive. "It's challenging," she admitted. "We look at preliminary results, methodology, timeline projections, and researchers' track record. But honestly, sometimes the most important factor is whether the person requesting funds has demonstrated they can manage resources responsibly and work collaboratively with others." "That makes sense," Evelyn said thoughtfully. "I imagine personality conflicts or management issues could derail even the most promising research." "Exactly," Dr. Chin agreed, warming to the topic. "Scientific brilliance means nothing if someone can't work with their team or meet their obligations to the institution. We've had to pull funding from researchers who showed great promise on paper, but created toxic work environments or failed to follow basic protocols." Evelyn nodded, filing away this information while she continued her work. "It must be frustrating when someone's personal issues interfere with potentially important research." "More common than you'd think, unfortunately," Dr. Chin said with a sigh. "Some researchers seem to believe that genius excuses bad behavior. It doesn't, of course, but try explaining that to someone who thinks they're the next Nobel Prize winner." The conversation continued for a few more minutes, covering general topics about research management and institutional priorities. To Dr. Chun, it probably seemed like casual small talk with an unexpectedly thoughtful cleaning lady. But Evelyn was gathering intelligence, learning about the standards and expectations that govern Dr. Hale's professional world. Standards and expectations he was currently failing to meet. After finishing the administrative wing, Evelyn returned to her rounds with a growing sense of purpose. For the first time in 8 years, she was thinking strategically again, planning moves and anticipating responses like she was preparing for a mission. Because that's exactly what this was. A mission to restore her own dignity and ensure that Dr. Marcus Hale understood the consequences of putting his hands on the wrong person. The next morning in Laboratory 7, she began her psychological campaign. Dr. Hale was at his computer when she entered, typing rapidly with the focused intensity of someone under pressure. He glanced up when she came in, and she saw the now familiar wariness in his eyes. Good. Uncertainty was a useful starting point. "Good morning, Dr. Hale," she said with professional politeness. "Morning," he replied curtly, returning to his work. Evelyn began her cleaning routine. But today she moved with subtle differences that she knew his subconscious would register even if he couldn't identify them consciously. Her posture was straighter, her movements more purposeful, her attention more focused on his equipment and notes than on maintaining her previous invisibility. After a few minutes, she spoke. "Dr. Hale, I hope you don't mind me mentioning this, but I couldn't help noticing that some of your cell cultures looked stressed yesterday. The ones in Incubator 3, specifically." He looked up sharply, surprise and suspicion warring in his expression. "I'm sorry, what?" "The cell cultures in Incubator 3, Evelyn repeated calmly. The morphology looked off, clumping that usually indicates contamination or suboptimal growth conditions. I thought you should know in case it affects your results." Dr. Hale stared at her for a long moment, clearly struggling to process what he'd just heard. Finally, he stood and walked to Incubator 3, opening it to examine the culture she'd mentioned. His face went pale. "How did you—" He stopped himself, looking back at her with an expression that was equal parts confusion and dawning alarm. "How do you know what stress cell cultures look like?" Evelyn continued cleaning, her voice matter-of-fact. "I've seen similar issues before. Contamination is usually the culprit, either bacterial or mycoplasma. You might want to test for mycoplasma, specifically. It's often overlooked because it doesn't cause obvious turbidity." The silence that followed was profound. Dr. Hale stood frozen by the incubator, staring at cultures that he now realized were indeed compromised, trying to understand how his cleaning lady had just demonstrated knowledge that most graduate students would struggle with. "Where exactly," he said slowly, "have you seen similar issues before?" Evelyn met his eyes directly. "Here and there. You picked things up over the years." It wasn't a lie exactly. She had picked things up over the years. During the 3 months she spent working as a research assistant for a military medical unit in Afghanistan, helping to test field treatments for battlefield injuries. It had been a temporary assignment while she recovered from a minor injury of her own, but she'd thrown herself into the work with her characteristic intensity, learning everything she could about laboratory procedures and biological research. Dr. Hale didn't need to know those details. What he needed to know was that the woman he'd dismissed as too stupid to understand scientific equipment had just demonstrated expertise he couldn't explain. He returned to his desk, but she could see him stealing glances at her as she worked, his mind obviously racing as he tried to reconcile this new information with his previous assumptions about who she was. Over the next week, Evelyn continued her campaign of strategic revelation. Small demonstrations of knowledge that shouldn't have been possible for someone in her position, observations that were too accurate to dismiss as lucky guesses, suggestions that proved to be exactly right when Dr. Hale investigated them further. She knew the proper names for complex laboratory equipment. She understood the principles behind various experimental procedures. She could identify potential problems with research protocols just by observing them being implemented. Each revelation chipped away at Dr. Hale's certainty about what kind of person he was dealing with. The confident arrogance that had allowed him to put his hands on her throat began to erode, replaced by a growing unease that he couldn't quite name. Who was this woman who cleaned his lab every morning? Where had she acquired knowledge that rivaled his graduate students? And why was she revealing it now, after 3 years of perfect invisibility? Dr. Hale was beginning to suspect that the incident with the broken beaker had awakened something he didn't understand and couldn't control. But he still had no idea how much danger he was actually in. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever felt invisible while knowing your true worth, hit that subscribe button right now. Because this story is about to prove that people like us are stronger than anyone imagined. Evelyn Cole is just getting started, and Dr. Hale has no idea what's coming for him. 2 weeks after the incident in Laboratory 7, Evelyn Cole stood in her apartment bathroom at 3 a.m., staring at her reflection in the mirror, while her body thrummed with energy she hadn't felt in years. The careful routine of revelation and psychological pressure was working exactly as she planned, but it was also awakening parts of her psyche that she thought were permanently dormant. She was remembering what it felt like to be a predator instead of prey. The thought should have disturbed her. For 8 years, she'd cultivated peace, acceptance, a quiet life free from conflict and drama. She'd told herself that her military career was behind her, that the skills and instincts that kept her alive in combat zones were no longer relevant to her civilian existence. But standing here in the harsh bathroom light, feeling the familiar surge of tactical thinking and strategic planning, she realized that peace had never been her natural state. It had been a kind of imposed hibernation, necessary while she cared for David, and then while she grieved his loss, but not her true nature. Her true nature was what had emerged in that moment, when Dr. Hale's hand closed around her throat, controlled, competent, and completely unafraid of whatever violence might be necessary to protect herself and others. She dressed for work with ritual precision, Each piece of her cleaning lady costume selected and donned with the same care she'd once given to camouflage and combat gear. But tonight felt different. Tonight felt like the calm before a storm she'd been building deliberately, carefully, with all the patience and skill of a master strategist. Dr. Marcus Hale was about to learn what happened when you attacked someone who'd spent decades learning how to win wars. The drive to Meridian Labs took her through empty streets that sparkled with frost under the streetlights. Winter was coming to the city, bringing with it the kind of crisp, clear nights that made everything seem sharp and defined. Perfect weather for what she had planned. Inside the building, her round proceeded normally until she reached Laboratory 7. Through the reinforced glass, she could see Dr. Hale hunched over his computer, but something about his posture suggested frustration rather than focused work. His hair was disheveled, his shirt wrinkled, and there were empty coffee cups scattered around his workspace. She knocked and entered without waiting for a response, a small boundary violation that she knew would register as another subtle shift in their dynamic. "Dr. Hale," she said with professional courtesy that bordered on mockery. "Working late again?" He looked up, and she saw immediately that her campaign of psychological pressure was having an intended effect. His eyes were bloodshot with exhaustion, his face drawn with stress. The confident arrogance that had once defined his interactions with her had been replaced by a wariness that was beginning to edge toward fear. "The funding committee wants preliminary results by Friday," he said, his voice hoarse with fatigue. "I'm trying to analyze the data from last month's experiments, but the results are inconsistent." Evelyn began her cleaning routine, moving through the lab with practiced efficiency, while keeping part of her attention on Dr. Hale's work. On his computer screen, she could see data tables and charts that told a story he probably didn't want to acknowledge. His research was failing, not just behind schedule, not just producing mixed results, but fundamentally flawed in ways that would be obvious to anyone with enough knowledge to interpret the data correctly. The experimental design had problems. The sample sizes were inadequate, and the statistical analysis was being manipulated to suggest conclusions that the evidence didn't support. Dr. Marcus Hale, the brilliant rising star of genetic research, was about to be exposed as someone who let desperation and ego compromise his scientific integrity. Evelyn finished cleaning the main work areas and moved toward his computer station, ostensibly to dust the desk surface. As she worked, she glanced at his screen with the kind of casual interest that had become her trademark over the past 2 weeks. "Interesting results," she said mildly, indicating the data tables. "Though I noticed some of the control groups seemed problematic." Dr. Hale's head snapped up. "What do you mean?" "Well," Evelyn continued, her tone remaining conversational, "your negative controls are showing activity that suggests either contamination or inadequate sample preparation, and some of your statistical comparisons appear to be using different baseline assumptions, which would invalidate the conclusions." The silence that followed was so complete that Evelyn could hear the hum of the building's ventilation system and the distant sound of security guards' footsteps in another wing. Dr. Hale stared at her with an expression of dawning horror, finally beginning to understand that the cleaning lady who'd been working around him for 3 years possessed knowledge that he couldn't explain and expertise that threatened everything he'd built. "Who are you?" he whispered. Evelyn met his eyes directly, letting him see for the first time the full force of the intelligence and capability she'd been hiding behind 8 years of invisibility. "I'm exactly who I've always been, Dr. Hale. You just never bothered to look." She returned to her cleaning, leaving him to stare at his corrupted data with the knowledge that someone he dismissed as stupid had just identified fatal flaws in work that would determine the future of his career. But this was only the beginning. Dr. Marcus Hale had put his hands on her in anger, had assumed she was too weak and ignorant to deserve basic respect. Now he was going to learn what those assumptions had cost him. Over the next 3 days, Evelyn escalated her campaign with surgical precision. She began asking pointed questions about his experimental procedures, suggesting modifications that revealed deep understanding of advanced research methodologies. She made casual observations about his data that demonstrated statistical knowledge that most PhD students would envy. Most disturbing of all, she began to demonstrate familiarity with military medical research, referencing studies from battlefield trauma centers, mentioning experimental protocols used in combat medicine, discussing research approaches that were classified at levels Dr. Hale had never even heard of. Each conversation left him more shaken, more uncertain about what kind of person he was dealing with. The cleaning lady facade was crumbling, revealing glimpses of someone with training and experience that made no sense in the context of her current position. By Friday morning, when Dr. Hale was scheduled to present his preliminary results to the funding committee, he was barely holding himself together. His hands shook as he prepared his presentation materials, and he kept glancing toward the door of his laboratory like he expected it to explode inward at any moment. Evelyn entered Laboratory 7 that morning to find him practicing his presentation, his voice cracking with stress as he tried to present flawed data as breakthrough research. "Dr. Hale," she said quietly, interrupting his rehearsal, "I think we need to talk." He turned to face her, and she saw that his carefully constructed professional persona had finally collapsed completely. Standing before her was not the arrogant scientist who grabbed her throat 2 weeks ago, but a frightened man who'd finally realized he'd made an enemy of someone whose capabilities he couldn't begin to comprehend. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn set down her cleaning supplies and straightened to her full height, letting him see for the first time the bearing and presence that had once commanded respect from soldiers in active combat zones. "I want," she said with quiet authority, "for you to understand exactly who you put your hands on that morning, and then we're going to discuss what happens next." The reckoning had begun. The silence in Laboratory 7 stretched between them like a taut wire, humming with tension that could snap at any moment. Dr. Marcus Hale stood frozen behind his desk, staring at the woman who had just shed her invisible cleaning lady persona, like a snake shedding its skin. The transformation was so complete, so sudden, that it felt like he was seeing her for the first time. Evelyn Cole stood with military bearing now, shoulders back, spine straight, feet planted in a stance that spoke of decades of training and absolute confidence in her own capabilities. Her gray eyes, which he'd never really noticed before, held an intensity that made his mouth go dry and his heart race with something that felt uncomfortably like prey recognizing a predator. "Sit down, Dr. Hale," she said quietly, and though it was phrased as suggestion, the tone carried the unmistakable weight of command. He sat. 22 years active duty, United States Army," Evelyn began, her voice carrying the crisp precision of someone giving a briefing. 3 combat tours in Afghanistan. Sergeant Major, responsible for the lives and safety of over 200 personnel. Decorated for valor under fire. Commended for leadership in crisis situations. Trusted with classified operations that you don't have clearance to even know exist. Dr. Hale's face had gone pale as she spoke, each detail hitting him like a physical blow as he began to understand the magnitude of his mistake. "I managed multi-million-dollar equipment in environments where a single error could kill dozens of people. I coordinated complex logistical operations under hostile fire. I made life-and-death decisions on a daily basis for over 2 decades, and the people under my command went home to their families because I was very, very good at my job." She took a step closer to his desk, and he instinctively shrank back in his chair. "So when you grabbed my throat that morning, Dr. Hale, when you assumed I was too stupid to understand your precious equipment, when you decided that your frustration gave you the right to put your hands on me in anger, you weren't attacking a helpless cleaning lady. You were assaulting a decorated combat veteran who has killed enemy combatants with her bare hands when the situation required it." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from an explosion. Dr. Hale's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, his mind struggling to process what he was hearing while his body flooded with adrenaline and the primitive fear response of someone who had just realized they were in mortal danger. "Now," Evelyn continued, her tone shifting to something almost conversational, "the question becomes what we do about that situation. You see, Dr. Hale, I spent the last 2 weeks studying you, learning your patterns, understanding your weaknesses, identifying exactly how vulnerable you really are." She gestured toward his computer screen, where his flawed research data still glowed in damning detail. "Your research is fundamentally compromised. The experimental design has basic flaws that any first-year graduate student should catch. Your statistical analysis is manipulated to support conclusions that your data doesn't justify. And your preliminary results, which you're presenting to the funding committee in 3 hours, are fraudulent." Dr. Hale found his voice at last, though it came out as a strangled whisper. I didn't falsify anything. Didn't you?" Evelyn's eyebrows rose slightly. "Shall we review your methodology together? Starting with the sample sizes that are too small to produce statistically significant results, moving to the control groups that were contaminated from day one, and finishing with the way you've cherry-picked data points to create the appearance of success where none exists." She moved around his desk with fluid grace, coming to stand behind his chair, where she could look over his shoulder at the computer screen. Dr. Hale went rigid as she leaned closer, her presence radiating a controlled menace that made every nerve in his body scream warnings. "Here," she said, pointing to a section of his data analysis. "You've excluded outlier data points that don't support your hypothesis, but you've kept outliers that do. That's not science, Dr. Hale. That's wishful thinking dressed up in academic language. Her finger moved to another section of the screen. And here, you applied different statistical tests to different data sets within the same experiment. Not because the data warranted different approaches, but because certain tests gave you the results you wanted while others didn't. Dr. Hale tried to speak, to defend himself, but no words came. Because everything she was saying was true. The pressure produced results. The fear of losing funding, the desperate need to salvage his reputation had led him down a path of increasingly compromised scientific integrity until he'd lost sight of where legitimate research ended and fraud began. You're wondering how I know all this, Evelyn continued, straightening but keeping her hands resting lightly on the back of his chair, close enough that he'd feel her presence like a physical weight. You're trying to figure out how a cleaning lady acquired the knowledge to dissect your research methodology with surgical precision. She moved back around the desk to face him, and the small smile playing at the corners of her mouth held no warmth whatsoever. During my third tour in Afghanistan, I spent 4 months working with a joint medical research unit, battlefield trauma medicine, experimental treatments for combat injuries, studies on psychological resilience under extreme stress. I wasn't just administrative support, Dr. Hale. I was a full participant in the research process, analyzing data, identifying procedural flaws, contributing to papers that were published in journals you probably cited in your own work. The revelation hit him like a sledgehammer. Not only was his cleaning lady a decorated combat veteran, she was someone with legitimate research experience who could recognize fraud because she understood what actual scientific rigor looked like. But that's not the real problem you're facing, Evelyn continued, settling into the chair across from his desk like she was conducting a friendly interview rather than dismantling his entire world. The real problem is what happens when I decide to share my observations about your research with the appropriate people. Dr. Hale's face went from pale to ashen. You can't. Can I? Dr. Sarachin chairs the Research Ethics Committee, doesn't she? And she strikes me as someone who takes scientific integrity very seriously. I imagine she'd be quite interested to learn about the methodological problems I've identified in your work. She leaned forward slightly, her gray eyes boring into his with laser focus. Or perhaps I should speak with Dean Morrison directly. I understand he's been following your research with great interest, given the substantial funding the university has invested in your laboratory. How do you think he'd react to discovering that their rising star has been presenting fraudulent results to secure continued support? Dr. Hale's hands were shaking now, his carefully constructed professional facade crumbling as the full implications of his situation became clear. Everything he'd worked for, everything he'd built his identity around, could be destroyed by this woman he dismissed as insignificant. "What do you want?" he asked again, his voice breaking. Evelyn studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. When she spoke, her voice carried the calm authority of someone who held all the power in the room and knew exactly how to use it. "What I want, Dr. Hale, is for you to understand that actions have consequences. You put your hands on me in anger because you believed I was powerless to stop you or retaliate against you. That was a catastrophic miscalculation." She stood and began pacing slowly in front of his desk, her movements controlled and predatory. "For 3 years, you've treated me like I was invisible. Never acknowledged my presence. Never showed basic human courtesy. Never once considered that the person cleaning your laboratory might be worthy of the slightest respect. That was merely unpleasant. But when you grabbed my throat, when you threatened my livelihood, when you decided that your frustration gave you the right to assault me, that crossed a line that can't be uncrossed." Dr. Hale watched her pace with growing terror, finally beginning to understand that he was no longer dealing with a service employee he could intimidate or dismiss. He was facing someone with skills, knowledge, and capabilities that he couldn't match, someone who had been trained to neutralize threats and eliminate problems with surgical precision. "So here's what's going to happen," Evelyn continued, stopping directly in front of his desk. "You're going to withdraw your presentation to the funding committee this morning. You're going to tell them that you've identified serious flaws in your preliminary results and need additional time to address them properly." "I can't," Dr. Hale whispered. "If I don't present today, they'll assume the research is failing. They'll pull my funding, investigate my previous work, destroy my career." "Yes," Evelyn agreed calmly. "They probably will. But here's the alternative. If you present fraudulent results today, I will personally ensure that every person in positions of authority at this institution understands exactly what kind of scientist you really are. Not just the methodological problems with your current work, but a comprehensive analysis of everything you've published over the past 5 years." The threat landed like a physical blow. Dr. Hale had been cutting corners and manipulating data for longer than he cared to admit. always telling himself it was just temporary expedients until he could produce genuine breakthroughs. But if someone with Evelyn's knowledge and analytical skills decided to examine his entire body of work, "You destroy everything," he said, his voice hollow with despair. "I'd expose the truth," Evelyn corrected. "There's a difference, though I understand why you might not see it that way." She leaned forward, placing her hands flat on his desk, bringing her face close enough to his that he could see every line of determination in her expression. "But I'm going to give you a choice, Dr. Hale, because, unlike you, I don't believe that power gives someone the right to destroy another person simply because they can." She straightened, her voice taking on the tone of someone delivering a final ultimatum. "You can withdraw your presentation voluntarily, acknowledge the problems with your research, and attempt to salvage what remains of your scientific integrity. It will probably mean the end of your career at Meridian Labs, but you'll have the opportunity to rebuild somewhere else, hopefully with a better understanding of what actual ethical research looks like." Dr. Hale stared at her, his mind racing as he tried to find some escape from the trap she constructed around him with such methodical precision. "Or," Evelyn continued, "you could present your fraudulent results this morning, in which case I will immediately contact Dr. Chun D. Morrison and every relevant professional organization to detail exactly what you've done and why it constitutes scientific fraud. Not only will your career be over, but you'll face potential criminal charges for misuse of federal research funds." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Dr. Hale's ragged breathing as he struggled with the impossible choice she'd given him. "Why?" he asked finally. "Why are you doing this to me?" Evelyn's expression softened slightly, but her voice remained implacable. "Because you put your hands on me in anger, Dr. Hale. Because you assumed that your position gave you the right to assault someone you consider beneath you. And because people like you never learn from gentle correction. Sometimes the only way to teach respect is to demonstrate the consequences of its absence." She gathered her cleaning supplies with brisk efficiency, preparing to leave him alone with his impossible decision. "You have 2 hours until the funding committee meeting," she said without looking back. "I suggest you use that time wisely." Dr. Marcus Hale sat alone in Laboratory 7 for exactly 17 minutes after Evelyn left, staring at a computer screen, while his world collapsed around him like a controlled demolition. The research data that had once represented his path to scientific glory now looked like what it had always been, a house of cards built on compromised methodology and wishful thinking. But Marcus Hale had not become a successful academic by accepting defeat gracefully. He had built his career on charm, manipulation, and the ruthless exploitation of every advantage he could identify or create. The cleaning lady might have exposed his research fraud, but she had also made a critical error. She had revealed her own capabilities while leaving herself vulnerable to retaliation. If Evelyn Cole thought she could destroy his career and walk away unscathed, she was about to learn that he was not as helpless as she assumed. Marcus began making phone calls. The first was to Security Director James Walsh, a former police detective whose loyalty could be purchased with the right combination of professional courtesy and implied future favors. "Jim, it's Marcus Hale in Laboratory 7. I need to report a serious security incident involving one of the cleaning staff." Walsh's interest was immediate. "What kind of incident, Dr. Hale?" "I have reason to believe that Evelyn Cole, one of the night shift cleaners, has been accessing confidential research data without authorization. This morning I caught her examining my computer screen and asking detailed questions about classified experimental procedures." It wasn't technically a lie. Evelyn had indeed examined his data and asked informed questions. The fact that she'd done so to expose his fraud rather than steal his research was a detail Marcus chose not to emphasize. "That's a serious allegation," Walsh said, his voice taking on the official tone he used when dealing with potential criminal matters. "Corporate espionage, unauthorized access to proprietary information. We're talking about federal charges, if you're right." "I understand the gravity of the situation," Marcus replied, letting his voice carry appropriate concern and reluctance. "I hate to make accusations against a long-term employee, but the question she was asking demonstrated knowledge that no cleaning person should possess. I'm worried about what she might have already compromised." Marcus knew that Walsh had been looking for an opportunity to demonstrate his value to the institution's administration. A genuine corporate espionage case would be exactly the kind of high-profile security issue that could advance his career and justify his apartment's budget. "I'll initiate an immediate investigation," Walsh said. "Full background check, review of her access records, interviews with other staff members. If she's been accessing confidential information, we'll find the evidence." The second call was to Dr. Richard Brennan, a colleague in the biochemistry department whose research had been overshadowed by Marcus's recent publications. Brennan was ambitious, resentful, and always eager to hear about problems that might damage his competitors. Richard, I thought you should know that we might have a security breach in the research wing. One of the cleaning staff has been asking suspiciously informed questions about ongoing experiments. Brennan's interest was immediate and malicious. Corporate espionage? That's serious business, Marcus. Which experiments were compromised? I can't go into specifics until security completes their investigation, but I thought you should know in case anyone approaches you with unusual questions about your own work. Marcus knew that Brennan would immediately begin spreading rumors about security breaches and corporate espionage, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and paranoia that would make Evelyn's position untenable long before she had the opportunity to expose his research fraud. The third call was to Dr. Patricia Vance, the Assistant Dean for Research Integrity, a woman whose career depended on her reputation for protecting the institution from scandal and maintaining relationships with major funding organizations. Patricia, I'm calling because I've discovered what might be a serious threat to the integrity of our research programs. I have evidence suggesting that confidential information is being accessed by unauthorized personnel. Dr. Vance's response was swift and decisive. If there's any possibility of a security breach, we need to act immediately to protect our funding relationships and institutional reputation. I'll convene an emergency review committee to assess the situation. Marcus knew that Vance's primary concern would be preventing any scandal that might jeopardize the university's relationship with federal funding agencies. The possibility that a cleaning person had been accessing classified research data would trigger immediate damage, control measures designed to isolate and neutralize the threat as quickly as possible. By the time Marcus finished his third phone call, he had successfully transformed himself from a potential criminal facing fraud charges into a whistleblower helping to expose a serious security breach. Evelyn Cole, the decorated combat veteran who thought she could destroy his career with impunity, was about to discover that academic politics could be just as ruthless as military combat. Marcus spent the next hour carefully constructing a narrative that would explain Evelyn's suspicious knowledge while positioning himself as a vigilant researcher who had detected the threat. She had clearly obtained unauthorized access to research data, probably through some combination of computer hacking and social engineering. Her military background actually supported this theory. Intelligence gathering was precisely the kind of skill set that would make someone effective at corporate espionage. The fact that she had used her knowledge to expose his research fraud rather than steal his data was irrelevant. By the time the investigation was complete, Evelyn would be facing federal charges for unauthorized access to classified information, and any accusation she made about his research methodology would be dismissed as the desperate lies of someone trying to avoid prosecution. Marcus felt his confidence returning as he reviewed his strategy. Evelyn Cole might be a decorated combat veteran with impressive analytical skills, but she was operating in his world now. Played by rules she didn't understand against opponents whose capabilities she had underestimated. She was about to learn that intellectual combat could be just as devastating as the physical kind. But Marcus had made one critical error in his assessment of the situation. He assumed that Evelyn had acted impulsively, that her confrontation with him that morning was the beginning of her campaign rather than the culmination of weeks of careful preparation. He had no idea that she had been gathering evidence of his research fraud for over a month, documenting his methodological failures with the same systematic attention to detail she had once applied to military intelligence operations. He didn't know that she had already compiled a comprehensive report detailing every instance of data manipulation and statistical fraud in his work, complete with a kind of meticulous documentation that would stand up in any professional or legal proceeding. Most importantly, he didn't understand that Sergeant Major Evelyn Cole had not survived 3 combat tours and 22 years of military service by underestimating her opponents or failing to anticipate their likely responses. She had known exactly what Marcus would do when she cornered him that morning. In fact, she had counted on it. While Marcus was making his phone calls and setting his trap, Evelyn was in Dean Morrison's office, delivering a presentation that would change everything. Dean Morrison, thank you for seeing me on such short notice. I know this is highly unusual, but I have information about a serious breach of scientific integrity that requires immediate attention. Dean Robert Morrison looked up from his desk with the politely curious expression he reserved for unexpected visitors. In 30 years of academic administration, he had learned to recognize when someone was bringing him a problem that could affect the institution's reputation and funding. Of course, MS. Cole, Evelyn Cole. I work night shift maintenance in the research wing. Evelyn sat straight back in the chair across from his desk, her bearing and manner so incongruous with her stated position that Morrison found himself paying closer attention than he normally would to a custodial employee. What kind of integrity breach are you referring to, Ms. Cole? Evelyn opened the folder she had carried into his office and placed a thick document on his desk. The cover page was labeled Research Fraud Analysis. Dr. Marcus Hale, Molecular Biology Department, in crisp, professional formatting that looked like it had been prepared by an experienced investigator. Dr. Hale has been systematically falsifying research data for at least 18 months, possibly longer. I have documented evidence of manipulated statistical analyses, excluded data points, compromised control groups, and fabricated results in work that has been funded by federal grants totaling over $3 million. Morrison's eyebrows rose sharply. Research fraud allegations were among the most serious issues he dealt with as dean, capable of destroying careers, triggering federal investigations, and costing the university millions in return funding and legal fees. That's an extremely serious accusation, Ms. Cole. What qualifies you to assess the integrity of Dr. Hale's research methodology? It was the question Evelyn had been waiting for, the moment when she would reveal her true qualifications to someone with the authority to act on her information. 22 years active duty, United States Army, retiring at the rank of Sergeant Major. During my third deployment to Afghanistan, I spent 4 months attached to the 455th Medical Research Detachment, working on battlefield trauma studies and experimental treatment protocols. I co-authored 6 peer-reviewed papers on combat medicine and psychological resilience, 3 of which were published in military medical journals. Morrison's expression shifted from polite attention to sharp focus. A decorated military veteran with legitimate research experience was precisely the kind of credible witness whose allegations could not be dismissed or ignored. After retiring from the Army, I took the position at Meridian to support my husband during his cancer treatment. When he passed away, I remained in the position because it provided stable income and health insurance while I decided what to do next with my life. She gestured toward the document on his desk. Over the past month, I've been observing Dr. Hale's research practices in the course of my cleaning duties. What I've witnessed represents a systematic pattern of scientific fraud that violates federal regulations governing research integrity. Morrison opened a folder and began scanning the first few pages. The analysis was thorough, professional, and devastating. Charts showing statistical manipulations, photographs of laboratory procedures that violated established protocols, detailed timelines connecting fraudulent data points to specific funding deadlines. "This is comprehensive," he said, looking up at Evelyn with new respect. "How did you gather this information?" Dr. Hale works late most nights, often leaving his computer screens visible while I clean his laboratory. Initially, I noticed the data inconsistencies by accident, but once I realized what I was seeing, I began documenting everything I observed. She leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on the crisp authority of someone delivering a military briefing. "Dean Morrison, I want to be clear about something. I didn't compile this report because I disliked Dr. Hale or want to damage his career. I did because scientific fraud in federally funded research is a crime that affects public trust in the entire academic enterprise. As someone who has served my country for over 2 decades, I consider it my duty to report criminal activity when I encounter it." Morrison continued reading, his expression growing more concerned with each page. The evidence was damning, but more than that, it was presented with a kind of meticulous attention to detail that would satisfy the most rigorous federal investigation. "Have you shared this information with anyone else, Ms. Cole?" "Not yet. I wanted to bring it to your attention first, out of respect for the institution's internal processes. However, I should mention that this morning, Dr. Hale became aware that I had identified problems with his research." Morrison looked up sharply. "What happened this morning?" Evelyn's expression remained neutral, but something in her tone suggested there was more to the story than she was initially revealing. Dr. Hale confronted me about observations I had made regarding his data analysis. When I confirmed that I had identified serious methodological problems, he became agitated. I believe he may attempt to discredit me or my findings rather than address the substance of my allegations. Morrison was experienced enough in academic politics to read between the lines. If Hale knew that someone had evidence of his research fraud, he would almost certainly try to destroy that person's credibility through whatever means necessary. "What kind of retaliation are you expecting, Ms. Cole?" "I suspect he will claim that I accessed his research data without authorization, possibly alleging corporate espionage or security breaches. It's a logical strategy. If he can portray me as a criminal, it undermines the credibility of my fraud allegations." Morrison nodded grimly. It was exactly the kind of desperate gambit that guilty parties often employed when facing exposure. "Ms. Cole, I want you to know that this institution takes research integrity extremely seriously, and we absolutely do not tolerate retaliation against whistleblowers who report legitimate concerns. If Dr. Hale attempts to file false accusations against you, he will find that such tactics only worsen his position. Evelyn allowed herself a small smile. I appreciate that assurance, Dean Morrison. I should also mention that if Dr. Hale does attempt retaliation, it will provide additional evidence of consciousness of guilt rather than behavior of an innocent person defending himself against false accusations. Morrison studied her for a moment, impressed despite himself by her strategic thinking and professional composure. In his experience, most people bringing research fraud allegations were nervous, uncertain, sometimes even hysterical. Evelyn Cole delivered her information like a military intelligence officer briefing a commanding general, calm, thorough, and completely confident in her conclusions. I'm going to initiate a formal investigation immediately, Morrison said. Full review by the Research Integrity Committee, external auditors if necessary, coordination with federal oversight agencies. If your allegations are substantiated, Dr. Hale will face termination, criminal charges, and disgorgement of all fraudulent funding. That's exactly what should happen, Evelyn replied. Scientific integrity is not negotiable, regardless of someone's reputation or position within the institution. Morrison closed the folder and looked directly into her eyes. Ms. Cole, I have to ask, why didn't you come forward sooner? If you've been observing these problems for months. Evelyn's expression became more serious, and for the first time since entering his office, she allowed some of her personal feelings to show through her professional demeanor, because until recently, I believed that being invisible was safer than being noticed. Dr. Hale has never treated me with respect or basic courtesy, but I accepted that as the price of keeping a job that provided stability and health insurance. She paused, and Morrison could see something harder and more determined flickering in her gray eyes. But 2 weeks ago, Dr. Hale crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. He put his hands on me in anger, grabbing my throat when an accident in his laboratory frustrated him. That assault made me realize that remaining silent about his criminal behavior was not protecting me or serving the greater good. Morrison's face darkened. Physical assault against university employees was grounds for immediate termination, regardless of any other considerations. He assaulted you? Why didn't you report that immediately? Because I wanted to gather enough evidence about his research fraud to ensure that he couldn't simply deny the assault and have me terminated for making false accusations. Dr. Hale is a respected scientist with tenure-track status and powerful allies. I'm a night shift cleaning lady. Without overwhelming evidence of his criminal behavior, it would have been his word against mine. The calculation was cold, strategic, and completely logical. Morrison found himself developing genuine respect for this woman who had endured assault and harassment while methodically building a case that would ensure justice was served. Ms. Cole, I give you my word that Dr. Hale will face consequences for both the research fraud and the assault. No one, regardless of their position or accomplishments, has a right to put their hands on another person in anger. Evelyn stood and straightened to her full height, and Morrison suddenly realized that the unassuming woman who cleaned laboratories had the bearing and presence of someone accustomed to command authority. Thank you, Dean Morrison. I trust that the investigation will be thorough and that appropriate action will be taken. If you need any additional information or clarification about my findings, I'm available at your convenience. She turned to leave, then paused at the door. One more thing, Dean Morrison. Dr. Hale is scheduled to present preliminary results to the funding committee this morning. Given what I've shown you about the fraudulent nature of that data, you might want to consider whether allowing that presentation to proceed serves the institution's interests. Morrison checked his watch and realized the funding committee meeting was scheduled to begin in less than an hour. Thank you for that reminder, Ms. Cole. I'll handle it. After she left, Morrison sat alone in his office, staring at the research fraud analysis and trying to process everything he had just learned. In the span of 30 minutes, a night shift cleaning lady had delivered the most comprehensive and damaging research fraud case he had encountered in his entire administrative career. But she wasn't just a cleaning lady, he realized. She was a decorated military veteran with legitimate research experience who had been systematically documenting criminal activity while enduring assault and harassment from someone who saw her as disposable. Morrison reached for his phone to begin the calls that would end Dr. Marcus Hale's career and quite possibly result in federal prosecution. But first, he had a funding committee meeting to cancel and some very uncomfortable conversations to initiate. Dr. Hale thought he was setting a trap for Evelyn Cole. He had no idea that she had already sprung one on him. The war was over. He just didn't know it yet. The first sign that Dr. Marcus Hale's world was collapsing came at 9:47 a.m., when his phone rang with a call from Dean Morrison's office. "Dr. Hale, this is Patricia Wells, Dean Morrison's assistant. The dean needs to see you in his office immediately regarding an urgent matter." Marcus felt a flutter of anxiety, but pushed it aside. The funding committee meeting wasn't scheduled until 10:30. There was still time to manage whatever crisis had developed. "Can you tell me what this is regarding, Patricia?" "I have the committee presentation this morning. The dean will explain everything when you arrive. Dr. Hale, he's asked me to tell you that the funding committee meeting has been postponed indefinitely." The words hit Marcus like ice water in his veins. Postponed indefinitely meant canceled, which meant someone had gotten to Morrison before he could present his carefully constructed version of events. Marcus ran through the corridors of Meridian Labs with his heart pounding, his mind racing through possibilities and contingency plans. Evelyn Cole had moved faster than he'd anticipated, but it wasn't too late to salvage the situation. He just needed to get to Morrison before the cleaning lady's accusations could gain traction. Dean Morrison's office was larger and more formally appointed than Marcus had remembered from his previous visits. Behind the massive oak desk, Morrison sat with the rigid posture of someone delivering bad news, while Dr. Sarachin occupied one of the chairs facing the desk. The Research Ethics Committee chair's presence confirmed Marcus's worst fears. "Dr. Hale, please sit down," Morrison said without preamble. "We have serious matters to discuss." Marcus took the remaining chair, forcing his expression into one of concerned cooperation. "Of course, Dean Morrison. Though I should mention that I've recently become aware of a potential security breach that might be relevant to whatever situation you're dealing with." Morrison's eyebrows rose slightly. "A security breach?" "I have reason to believe that one of the cleaning staff has been accessing confidential research data without authorization. This morning I discovered that Evelyn Cole has been examining my computer screens and asking detailed questions about classified experimental procedures. I was planning to report it to security after my committee presentation." The silence that followed was so profound that Marcus could hear his own heartbeat. Morrison and Dr. Chun exchanged a look that contained volumes of communication he couldn't interpret. "Dr. Hale," Morrison said finally, "I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you. Ms. Evelyn Cole came to my office this morning with a comprehensive analysis of systematic research fraud in your laboratory. She has documented evidence of data manipulation, statistical fraud, compromised experimental design, and fabricated results spanning at least 18 months of your work." The words hit Marcus like physical blows, each one driving him deeper into a hole he suddenly realized had been carefully prepared for him. That's impossible," he stammered. "She's a cleaning lady. She doesn't have the background or training to understand research methodology." Dr. Chin leaned forward, her voice carrying the cold precision of someone delivering a professional death sentence. "Ms. Cole is a retired Army sergeant major with 22 years of active duty service and legitimate research experience in military medical studies. She co-authored multiple peer-reviewed papers and has the exact qualifications necessary to identify the fraudulent practices she's documented in your work." Marcus felt the room spinning around him as the full scope of his miscalculation became clear. Evelyn Cole wasn't just a cleaning lady who had stumbled onto evidence of his research problems. She was a trained investigator who had been systematically building a case against him with military precision and professional expertise. "Furthermore," Morrison continued, "Ms. Cole has informed us that you physically assaulted her 2 weeks ago, grabbing her by the throat in anger when a laboratory accident frustrated you. Physical assault against university employees is grounds for immediate termination, regardless of any other considerations." Marcus's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Everything was happening too fast, spiraling completely out of his control before he could implement any of his defensive strategies. "I want to see this alleged evidence," he said desperately. "I want to examine these accusations and respond to them properly. You can't just accept the word of someone with obvious motives to make false allegations." Dr. Chin opened a folder on her lap and began reading in a voice that carried no emotion whatsoever. "Exhibit A, statistical manipulation in your October 2023 cancer treatment study, where you excluded 17 data points that didn't support your hypothesis while retaining 12 outliers that did, resulting in artificially significant results that would disappear with proper statistical analysis." She turned the page. "Exhibit B, compromised control groups in your February 2024 genetic therapy experiment, where bacterial contamination was evident from day 3 of the study, but you continued collecting data for 6 weeks, presenting the corrupted results as valid findings." Another page. "Exhibit C, fabricated data points in your grant renewal application, where you reported results from experiments that were never actually conducted, supporting funding requests totaling over $1 million. With each exhibit Dr. Chen read, Marcus felt another piece of his carefully constructed professional identity crumble away. The evidence was devastating not just because it was accurate, but because it was presented with a kind of meticulous documentation that would satisfy the most rigorous federal investigation. "This is a coordinated attack," Marcus said, his voice rising with desperation. "This woman has been planning this for months, gathering information illegally, probably working with competitors who want to damage my research. You can't seriously be considering the allegations of someone who has been engaging in corporate espionage." Morrison's expression hardened. "Dr. Hale, let me be absolutely clear about something. Ms. Cole did not illegally access your research data. She observed your work in the normal course of her cleaning duties that gave her legitimate access to your laboratory during times when you chose to leave sensitive information visible. The fact that you were careless enough to expose fraudulent research practices to someone with the training to recognize them is not her fault. It's yours." Dr. Chen closed the folder with a sharp snap. "Dr. Hale, based on the evidence Ms. Cole has provided, the Research Ethics Committee is initiating a formal investigation into research misconduct. You are suspended from all research activities effective immediately, pending the outcome of that investigation. Your laboratory access is revoked, your graduate students will be reassigned, and all federal funding associated with your work is frozen." Marcus felt his chest tightening as the full implications of his situation became clear. Suspension meant professional death in academia. No other institution would hire a researcher under investigation for fraud, and even if he was eventually cleared, the cloud of suspicion would follow him for the rest of his career. "You're destroying my life based on the accusations of someone with a clear grudge against me," Marcus said, his voice cracking with desperation. "She's retaliating because I reported her security violations. This is exactly the kind of malicious prosecution that innocent people fear when they try to do the right thing." Morrison leaned back in his chair, studying Marcus with the kind of clinical interest usually reserved for particularly interesting pathologies. "Dr. Hale, there's something you should understand about the timeline of events. Ms. Cole began documenting problems with your research over a month ago, weeks before whatever incident you're claiming occurred between you. Her investigation preceded any conflict you might have had with her, which means your retaliation theory doesn't hold water." The revelation hit Marcus like a sledgehammer. Evelyn hadn't started building her case because he grabbed her throat. She'd already been gathering evidence when that confrontation happened, which meant, "She set me up," he whispered, the full scope of her strategic planning finally becoming clear to him. "She provoked the incident to give herself additional leverage against me." Dr. Chen's expression showed something that might have been pity if it hadn't been so cold. "Dr. Hale, even if that were true, which it isn't, you're essentially admitting that you physically assaulted a university employee because someone provoked you. That's not a defense. That's a confession." Morrison stood, signaling that the meeting was over. "Dr. Hale, you have 24 hours to clear out your personal belongings from Laboratory 7. Security will escort you during that process to ensure that no research materials or university property are removed. Your university email account and computer access will be terminated at 5 p.m. today." Marcus sat frozen in his chair, his mind struggling to process the complete destruction of everything he'd worked for over the past 15 years. His research, his reputation, his future, all of it gone because he'd underestimated a cleaning lady who turned out to be a decorated combat veteran with a genius for strategic warfare. "What about due process?" he asked weakly. "Don't I get a hearing, a chance to defend myself?" "You'll have every opportunity to respond to the formal charges once the investigation is complete," Morrison replied. "But the evidence Ms. Cole has provided is so comprehensive and damning that suspension is the only appropriate response while we determine whether criminal charges are warranted." Criminal charges. The words echoed in Marcus's mind like a death knell. Federal research fraud carried penalties of up to 5 years in prison and millions in fines. Even if he avoided jail time, he would be barred from receiving federal funding for the rest of his career, effectively ending any possibility of working in legitimate scientific research. Marcus left Morrison's office in a daze, walking through corridors that had once represented his domain, but now felt like foreign territory where he no longer belonged. Students and colleagues he passed avoided eye contact, and he realized that word of his suspension was already spreading through the gossip networks that connected every corner of academic life. By the time he reached Laboratory 7, Security Director James Walsh was waiting for him with 2 uniformed guards and a set of empty boxes. "Dr. Hale," Walsh said with professional courtesy that barely concealed his satisfaction at this turn of events. I'm here to supervise the removal of your personal belongings. Please note that all research materials, data, and equipment remain property of the university and cannot be removed. Marcus looked around the laboratory that had been his sanctuary for 3 years, the place where he conducted the work that was supposed to establish his legacy as a brilliant scientist. Now it looked like a crime scene being processed by investigators who saw him as a suspect rather than a victim. "This is insane," Marcus said to Walsh as he began emptying his desk drawers. "That woman has been conducting industrial espionage, probably selling research data to competitors, and somehow she's managed to convince Morrison that I'm the criminal." Walsh's expression remained neutral, but Marcus caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested he knew more about the situation than he was willing to discuss. "Dr. Hale, I conducted a preliminary background check on Ms. Cole after you reported your concerns this morning. Her military service record is exemplary. Multiple commendations, security clearances at levels most civilians never achieve, a reputation for absolute integrity among her commanding officers. If she says she observed research fraud, my professional assessment is that she observed research fraud." The words hit Marcus like another physical blow. Even the security director, who'd been positioned as his ally, had turned against him once the full truth came to light. Marcus continued packing his personal belongings in silence, his mind racing through increasingly desperate scenarios that might allow him to salvage something from this catastrophe. But every avenue he explored led to the same conclusion. Evelyn Cole had constructed her case with such methodical precision that there was no defense against it except the truth, and the truth was that everything she'd accused him of was accurate. He was guilty of research fraud. He had manipulated data, excluded inconvenient results, and fabricated findings to support funding applications. He had put his hands on her in anger, assaulting a woman who was simply trying to do her job, and he had spent years treating her with casual cruelty because he'd assumed she was powerless to retaliate against him. Those assumptions had cost him everything. As Marcus carried his boxes toward the parking lot, escorted by security guards like a criminal being removed from the scene of his crimes, he passed the maintenance closet where Evelyn kept her cleaning supplies. The door was open, and he could see her inside, organizing her equipment with the same military precision she'd apparently applied to destroying his career. She looked up as he passed, and for a moment their eyes met. Marcus expected to see triumph in her expression, satisfaction at having brought down someone who'd wronged her. Instead, he saw something that looked almost like pity, the kind of expression someone might wear while watching a self-destructive person finally face the consequences of their choices. "Dr. Hale," she said quietly, "I hope you understand that none of this was personal. But actions have consequences, and some lines can't be uncrossed." Marcus wanted to respond with anger, accusations, threats of legal retaliation. But standing there with a career in boxes and his future in ruins, facing the woman who'd outmaneuvered him with such devastating effectiveness, he found he had no words left. He simply nodded once and continued toward the parking lot, leaving behind the laboratory where his arrogance and cruelty had finally caught up with him. Behind him, Evelyn returned to organizing her supplies, but her movements carried a satisfaction that had nothing to do with cleaning equipment and everything to do with justice finally served. The investigation that followed Marcus Hale's suspension unfolded with the kind of methodical thoroughness that Evelyn Cole had made inevitable through the quality of evidence she provided. Dr. Sarachin chaired a review committee that included external auditors, federal oversight representatives, and independent scientists with no connection to Meridian Labs. Their findings, released 6 weeks later, were devastating. The committee confirmed every allegation Evelyn had made, documenting a pattern of research fraud that extended back nearly 3 years and encompassed multiple federally funded projects totaling over $4.2 million. The report detailed systematic data manipulation, fabricated results, compromised experimental protocols, and deliberate misrepresentation of findings in grant applications and published papers. But the most damaging finding was the committee's conclusion that Marcus's fraud had potentially set back legitimate cancer research by months or years, as other scientists had wasted time and resources trying to replicate his fabricated results or build upon his false foundations. The criminal referral to federal prosecutors followed within days. Marcus Hale's career ended not with the gradual decline of someone whose work had simply become irrelevant, but with the spectacular collapse of someone whose dishonesty had finally been exposed by an adversary he'd never seen coming. The irony wasn't lost on anyone at Meridian Labs. The brilliant scientist had been brought down by the cleaning lady he dismissed as too stupid to understand his work. But those who knew the full story understood that Marcus Hale hadn't been defeated by a cleaning lady at all. He'd been outmaneuvered by a decorated combat veteran whose strategic thinking and investigative skills had been honed by decades of military service in the most dangerous environments on Earth. Sergeant Major Evelyn Cole had simply been wearing a cleaning lady's uniform while she planned and executed one of the most effective takedowns in the institution's history. 3 months after Marcus's suspension, Dean Morrison called Evelyn back to his office. This time, however, the conversation was very different. Ms. Cole, I want to begin by thanking you for your service to this institution and to the cause of scientific integrity. Your courage in coming forward with evidence of research fraud has protected the university from significant legal and financial liability. Evelyn sat with the same military bearing she displayed during their previous meeting, but Morrison could see a subtle change in her demeanor, a sense of completion, of a mission accomplished. I did what needed to be done, Dean Morrison. Research integrity is negotiable, regardless of someone's position or reputation. Morrison nodded, then leaned forward with an expression of genuine interest. Ms. Cole, I have a proposition for you. Dr. Chun has recommended that we create a new position in research integrity oversight, someone who would work directly with the ethics committee to monitor ongoing projects and investigate potential problems. The position would require someone with investigative experience, analytical skills, and the courage to challenge respected researchers when necessary. Evelyn's eyebrows rose slightly. You're offering me a job? I'm offering you a career that makes use of your actual qualifications instead of wasting them on custodial work. The position would come with full benefits, a salary commensurate with your experience and education, and the opportunity to ensure that what happened with Dr. Hale never happens again at this institution. For the first time since Marcus had grabbed her throat, Evelyn allowed herself to smile with genuine pleasure. Dean Morrison, I accept your offer. When do I start? 6 months later, Evelyn Cole walked to the corridors of Meridian Labs wearing a professional business suit instead of custodial uniform, carrying herself with the confidence of someone whose expertise was finally being recognized and valued. Her office was located in the administrative wing, with a nameplate that read Evelyn Cole, Director of Research Integrity, and a view of the campus that reminded her every day of how much her life had changed. The transformation hadn't just been professional. For the first time since David's death, Evelyn felt like she was using her skills and experience in service of something meaningful. She was protecting the integrity of scientific research, ensuring that federal funding went to legitimate projects, and making sure that no other researcher could abuse their position with impunity. She was in many ways doing the same job she'd done in the military, protecting people and principals that couldn't protect themselves, using her training and expertise to identify and neutralize threats before they could cause irreparable damage. The work was challenging, requiring her to understand complex research methodologies across multiple scientific disciplines. But Evelyn approached it with the same systematic intensity she'd once applied to military operations, becoming an expert in areas ranging from statistical analysis to laboratory safety protocols. More importantly, she'd found a community of colleagues who respected her capabilities and valued her contributions. Dr. Chun had become both a mentor and a friend, helping Evelyn navigate academic politics while learning from her investigative expertise. Dean Morrison regularly sought her input on policy decisions, trusting her judgment in ways that Marcus Hale never could have imagined. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of her new role was the deterrent effect her presence had on potential fraudsters throughout the institution. The story of Marcus Hale's downfall had spread through academic networks far beyond Meridian Labs, creating a legend about the cleaning lady who brought down a corrupt scientist through superior intelligence and strategic planning. Researchers across the university knew that someone was watching, someone with the training to detect fraud and the courage to act on what she discovered. The knowledge that Evelyn Cole was monitoring research integrity had a prophylactic effect on behavior, encouraging better practices, and deterring the kind of shortcuts that had destroyed Marcus's career. On the anniversary of Marcus Hale's suspension, Evelyn drove to the military cemetery, where David was buried, carrying with her a sense of completion that had been missing from her life for years. She'd found her way back to meaningful work, had proven that her skills and experience still had value, and had demonstrated that dignity and integrity would always triumph over arrogance and cruelty. Standing beside David's grave in the quiet morning sunlight, she told him about the year that had changed everything for her. I know you'd be proud, she said softly, placing fresh flowers on his headstone. I finally remembered who I was before I became invisible, and I made sure that someone who thought he could hurt people without consequences learned otherwise. The wind rustled through the trees overhead, and for a moment Evelyn could almost hear David's voice telling her what he'd always told her during their 30 years together, that she was stronger than she knew, braver than she believed, and capable of achieving anything she set her mind to accomplish. She'd spent 8 years forgetting those truths. But when Marcus Hale put his hands on her throat, when he dismissed her as too stupid to matter, when he assumed that his position gave him the right to assault and humiliate someone he considered beneath him. He awakened a warrior who'd been dormant but never defeated. The invisible cleaning lady was gone forever. In her place stood Director Evelyn Cole, protector of scientific integrity, defender of institutional values, and living proof that underestimating the wrong person could cost you everything you'd ever worked to achieve. Dr. Marcus Hale had learned that lesson the hard way, and every researcher at Meridian Labs understood that the standards Evelyn enforced were non-negotiable, regardless of someone's reputation, position, or assumptions about who deserved respect. Justice, Evelyn had proven, could come from the most unexpected places, and sometimes the most dangerous adversary was the one you never bothered to see as human. 2 years after Dr. Marcus Hale's conviction on federal fraud charges and sentencing to 18 months in prison, Evelyn Cole stood before the graduating class of Meridian University's Research Ethics Program, a curriculum she had helped design and implement as Director of Research Integrity. The auditorium was packed with graduate students, postdoctoral researchers, and faculty members who had come to hear her deliver the keynote address on The Invisible Guardians, why every voice matters in scientific integrity. But for Evelyn, looking out at the sea of faces representing the future of scientific research, this moment was about more than professional achievement. It was about the completion of a transformation that had begun in the most unlikely way, with a hand around her throat and a choice between remaining invisible or reclaiming her power. When I first came to Meridian Labs 8 years ago, Evelyn began, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium, I thought my days of serving something larger than myself were over. I'd spent 22 years in the Army protecting people and principles I believed in, but civilian life seemed to offer no place for those skills and values. She paused, scanning the audience with the same attention to detail that had once helped her keep soldiers alive in combat zones. I accepted invisibility as the price of stability. I convinced myself that being overlooked and undervalued was a reasonable trade-off for steady employment and health insurance. I forgot that dignity isn't something you negotiate away. It's something you either claim or surrender, but never something you can recover by remaining silent. In the third row, Dr. Sarah Chin smiled with pride at how far her colleague had come from the quiet cleaning lady who had once asked thoughtful questions about research methodology. Beside her, Dean Morrison nodded approvingly, knowing that Evelyn's story had become legendary not just at Meridian, but throughout academic circles nationwide. The turning point came when someone decided that my invisibility gave them the right to put their hands on me in anger, Evelyn continued, her voice hardening slightly as she remembered that morning in Laboratory 7. In that moment, I had to choose between accepting assault as part of my job description or remembering who I really was underneath the uniform I'd been wearing. She moved across the stage with fluid grace, her bearings still carrying traces of the military precision that had defined her for decades. I chose to remember, and what I remember was that I had never been invisible. I had simply allowed others to look through me because I thought it was safer than being seen. But there is no safety in invisibility, only the illusion of protection purchased at the cost of self-respect. The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word as Evelyn shared insights that went far beyond research ethics to touch on fundamental questions of human dignity and personal courage. The person who attacked me assumed that his position and reputation gave him immunity from consequences. He believed that someone in my position couldn't possibly pose a threat to someone in his. That assumption cost him his career, his freedom, and his future because he failed to understand a basic truth about power. Evelyn stopped center stage, looking directly into the audience with the same intensity she'd once brought to mission briefings. Real power doesn't come from your title or your salary or the respect others show to your position. Real power comes from your knowledge, your integrity, your willingness to act on your principles regardless of the personal cost. And that kind of power can't be taken away by someone who thinks you don't matter. The applause that followed was spontaneous and sustained, but Evelyn raised her hand for silence as she prepared to deliver the most important part of her message. Every person in this auditorium will encounter scientific misconduct during your career. You will witness fraud, corruption, abuse of power, violations of research integrity that threaten the very foundations of scientific knowledge. And when those moments come, you'll face the same choice I faced: remain silent and invisible, or find the courage to act on what you know is right. She moved closer to the edge of the stage, her voice dropping to a more intimate tone that somehow carried just as clearly to the back of the auditorium. Some of you will tell yourselves that it's not your responsibility, that someone else will speak up, that your voice doesn't matter enough to make a difference. I understand those feelings because I lived with them for 8 years while I watched misconduct happen around me every day. Evelyn's expression became more serious, and everyone in the audience could feel the weight of hard-earned experience behind her words. But I'm here to tell you that your voice does matter. Your observations are important. Your courage to speak truth to power can save careers, protect public trust in science, and ensure that research serves humanity rather than individual ego. The person who seems powerless to you, the laboratory technician, the graduate student, the administrative assistant, might be the one with the knowledge and integrity to expose corruption that would otherwise destroy lives. She straightened to her full height, and everyone present could see the transformation that had taken her from invisible cleaning lady to respected institutional leader. Never assume that someone doesn't matter because of their position or their title. Never believe that you're powerless because others seem to have more authority. And never, ever think that remaining silent is safer than speaking truth when you encounter it. The final round of applause was thunderous, lasting nearly 5 minutes as the audience rose to their feet to honor not just Evelyn's words, but her extraordinary journey from invisibility to influence. After the ceremony, Evelyn drove through the city to Arlington National Cemetery, where David had been laid to rest 3 years earlier. The late afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the precisely aligned headstones that marked the final resting places of those who had served their country. She knelt beside David's grave and placed fresh flowers on the headstone. White roses, his favorite, arranged with the same care she brought to every aspect of her life. "I did it, David," she said softly, her voice carrying across the quiet cemetery. "I remembered who we were before the world tried to make us invisible, and I made sure that someone who thought he could hurt people without consequences learned otherwise." The wind rustled through the trees overhead, and Evelyn could almost hear David's voice telling her what he'd always told her during their 30 years together, that she was stronger than she knew, braver than she believed, and capable of achieving anything she set her mind to accomplish. "I know you'd be proud of what I built," she continued, tracing his name on the headstone with gentle fingers. "Not just a job or recognition, but the way I found my way back to serving something that matters. The way I learned that dignity isn't something you can lose unless you give it away." She sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the shadows lengthen as the sun moved toward the horizon. Around her, other visitors paid their respects to loved ones who had answered the call to serve, creating a quiet community of remembrance and honor. "I think about Marcus Hale sometimes," Evelyn said eventually, not with anger anymore, but with something that might be gratitude. "Because if he hadn't put his hands on me that morning, if he hadn't forced me to choose between accepting abuse and reclaiming my power, I might have stayed invisible forever." She stood and brushed grass from her knees, looking down at David's grave with a mixture of love and acceptance that had taken years to achieve. "He taught me that the most dangerous adversary is the one you never bother to see as human. And I taught him that underestimating the wrong person can cost you everything you've worked to achieve." The drive home took her through neighborhoods that had become familiar over the past 2 years, past restaurants where she met friends for dinner, bookstores where she browsed on weekend afternoons, coffee shops where she read research papers and planned new initiatives for the Research Integrity Office. It was a full life now, rich with purpose and connection in ways that would have seemed impossible during her 8 years of invisible servitude. She had colleagues who respected her expertise, students who sought her mentorship, administrators who valued her judgment on matters of institutional importance. But more than the professional success, more than the recognition or the salary or the office with her name on the door, Evelyn had reclaimed something infinitely more valuable: her sense of self-worth, her understanding of her own capabilities, her refusal to accept treatment that diminished her humanity. That evening, Evelyn sat in her apartment, larger now, better furnished, filled with books and photographs and mementos that reflected a life being actively lived rather than passively endured. Her laptop was open on the coffee table, displaying an email from a graduate student at another university who had read about her story and wanted advice about reporting research misconduct in her own department. It was one of dozens of similar messages Evelyn received each month, from students and researchers and laboratory workers who had witnessed fraud or abuse but weren't sure they had the power or authority to act on what they'd seen. Each message reminded her that her story had become larger than her personal experience, that her transformation from invisible cleaning lady to respected institutional leader had inspired others to find their own courage. She began typing her response, drawing on years of experience in both military operations and academic politics to provide practical guidance that might help another person navigate the complex dynamics of speaking truth to power. "The most important thing to remember," she wrote, "is that your observations matter regardless of your position in the institutional hierarchy. Truth doesn't become less true because it comes from someone without an advanced degree or an impressive title. Justice doesn't become less important because the person seeking it works night shifts or wears a uniform that makes them invisible to those who should know better. She paused in her typing, remembering the moment when she'd first decided to document Marcus Hale's research fraud rather than simply accepting his cruelty as the cost of employment. Courage isn't the absence of fear, she continued writing. It's the decision to act on your principles, even when you're afraid of the consequences. And sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is refuse to remain invisible when visibility feels dangerous. After sending the email, Evelyn walked to her bedroom window and looked out at the city lights stretching toward the horizon. Somewhere out there, other people were facing the same choice she'd faced 2 years ago, between accepting mistreatment and risking everything to demand better. She hoped her story would give them the courage to choose dignity over safety, truth over silence, visibility over the comfortable anonymity that felt protective but ultimately proved hollow. Because Evelyn Cole had learned, through pain and perseverance and ultimate triumph, that the most powerful weapon against those who would abuse their authority was a refusal to remain invisible when it mattered most. Dr. Marcus Hale had grabbed her throat thinking he was attacking a powerless cleaning lady. Instead, he'd awakened a warrior who understood that true strength came not from position or title, but from the courage to stand up for what was right regardless of the personal cost. And that warrior would never be invisible again. So here's my question for you. What would you have done if you were Evelyn? If someone had grabbed you by the throat, dismissed your intelligence, treated you as invisible for years while you had the power to expose their lies? Would you have stayed silent to protect yourself, or would you have found the courage to fight back? Tell me in the comments below. Share your thoughts, your own stories of being underestimated, your moments when you had to choose between safety and dignity. And if you believe that true strength comes from standing up for what's right, if you believe that dignity and integrity always win in the end, hit that subscribe button right now. Because more powerful stories like this are coming. Stories about ordinary people who found extraordinary courage when it mattered most. The invisible warriors are all around us. Sometimes we just need to be reminded to see them. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.